that the earlier you go to look at the manuscripts, the more differences you find. The earliest copies have the most mistakes. What would happen if we found copies that were still earlier? The only evidence we have is the evidence that survives, which suggests that in the early periods of copying, there was the most mistakes made. How many were made the first month, or the first year, or the first decade? How many mistakes were made in the copy of the copy of the copy, which served as the copy of all the copies that we now have? We have no way of knowing. If Craig thinks that we have a way of knowing how the gospel was changed in its first 100 years, I want to know what the answer is, because I've worked on this problem for 30 years, and I don't know of a way to know, and I've never seen a good explanation. You can't argue that that we have lots and lots of copies of Mark, and therefore we know what was originally in Mark. These lots and lots of copies are from many centuries after Mark was written. How could we know that these copies stem from a correct copy instead of an errant copy? Our earliest ones are all highly errant. Sometimes you will hear Christian apologists say that the New Testament is the best attested book from antiquity, and therefore you can trust it. It's true it's the best attested book from antiquity, but the attestation is all from 1,000 years later. It doesn't make sense to say that you can trust it because it's well attested. If the New Testament was well attested, then you could say what the New Testament originally said. Whether you should trust it or not is another question. But the reality is we have lots of late manuscripts of Mark and of every other book of the New Testament. We don't have early ones, and the earliest ones we have are filled with mistakes.
Question number 6. Have the Gospels been accurately preserved down through the centuries? Dr. Evans.
If you attend the conference at Midwestern Baptist Seminary on Friday and Saturday, you will become acquainted with several other renowned textual critics. And they know this material better than I do, and they know it, I suspect, as well as Professor Ehrman. And you will hear from them a very different answer from the one you've just heard. But here is what I have written. I believe the Gospels have been accurately preserved down through the centuries, though I suppose some skeptics could say something to this effect. We don't have the originals of Matthew or of Paul's letters or of any book of the New Testament. What we have are copies of these books. Most copies are hundreds of years after the originals, and all of them have differences in them. Scribes would change the Gospels to reflect their own view, and so on and so forth. Examples of this could include, I suppose, Luke 22:43-44, which tells us an angel ministered to Jesus while he was in prayer in Gethsemane, and that sweat like drops of blood fell from his brow. Our oldest manuscripts do not have these verses. Moreover, nothing like these verses occurs in the other Gospels. Textual critics and commentators suspect these verses represent a later scribal gloss, a dramatic embellishment of the scene, as it were, perhaps even an upgrade of Jesus' divine status. In their edition of the Greek New Testament, Bruce Metzger and his colleagues rightly place these verses in square brackets, indicating that they doubt very much they were in the original. I agree with their decision. If we all agree and so omit these verses from Luke's Gospel, have we lost a significant element of the Passion story or of the divine status of Jesus so clearly taught elsewhere? No. The ending of Mark's Gospel appears to be lost. Here I mean the last 12 verses. What in the King James Version is presented as Mark 16, verses 9 to 20. Commentators on Mark are divided as to whether Mark had a resurrection narrative. Some think Mark ended at verse 8, some think Mark continued. I'm inclined to think Mark continued, for in every case in Mark's Gospel, Jesus' predictions are fulfilled, and he predicted that he would be raised up and would appear to his disciples. Robert Gundry, commentator on Matthew and Mark, thinks some of Mark's lost ending is found, in fact, in Matthew 28. In any event, whatever we decide, the other three Gospels narrate resurrection appearances, and so does Paul, whose confessional reminder that Jesus was buried and that he was raised on the third day in 1 Corinthians 15:4 is quite old, predating the Gospels themselves. The loss of an ending in Mark may be frustrating, but it hardly casts doubt on the resurrection story without which the church would never have come into existence. Another famous 12-verse textual problem concerns the woman caught in the act of committing adultery, who then is brought to Jesus, perhaps to be judged. Traditionally, the passages found in John 7:53 to 8:11, our oldest manuscripts reaching back to the end of the 2nd century, do not have the passage. They proceed from 7:52 to 8:12 without interruption. The passage appears elsewhere in John and some later manuscripts, and even appears in Luke in one or two late manuscripts. Most scholars agree that the story is not original to John. Scholars debate if it's authentic, with some weighing in on one side and others on the other side. I'm not sure myself. If we decide that it's not original to John and also not authentic, what have we lost? To be sure, we lose a beautiful story, but no theology, no significant information about Jesus, for we know from many other passages that Jesus reached out to sinners and offered forgiveness. We could mention several other passages where there are minor variants, but again, not one impacts Christian faith in any significant way. Competent scholars acknowledge the realities of hand-copied manuscripts. No manuscript of any length is free from errors of one kind or another. Most of these errors are negligible in importance, such as spelling and grammatical irregularities, accidental or intentional, omitted or added words and phrases. We have more than 5,400 manuscripts that predate Gutenberg's printing press. Some 4 date to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. P52, a small fragment of John 18, may date as early as 120 AD. If so, this means that we have a fragment of a text that was copied when in all probability the original of the Gospel of John, the autograph, which probably dates to the mid-90s, was still in existence and perhaps still in circulation. By the way, Professor Ehrman refers to many copies that introduce new errors, but also many copies correct errors that scribes before them had made. I'll have more to say about this topic at the very end.
Question number 7, our final question. Do scribal errors and textual variants significantly impact any teaching of Jesus or any important Christian teaching?
Let me start by saying that when Craig says that the following view is a view of skeptics, that we don't have the originals, we have only copies, that thousands of copies have thousands and 10,000s of mistakes. When he calls that the view of skeptics, it's true, that is the view of skeptics, and it's the view of non-skeptics. It's the view of every scholar who works in this field, including Craig. Everybody agrees. We don't have the originals, we have thousands of copies, and the thousands of copies have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of differences among them. Are any of these differences important? Or are they all fluff? Did Jesus say, "Let the one who is without sin be the first to cast a stone at her"? It's a wonderful and familiar saying of Jesus, but it's based on a scribal variation that is an error. It was not originally in the New Testament Gospels, as Craig has just told us. Did Jesus say, "Neither do I condemn you, go and sin no more"? Well, does it matter whether Jesus said it or not? Turns out it's only in a textual variant. It was not in the original New Testament. Did Jesus say, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to the whole creation. He who believes in me and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not will be condemned"? It's found only in a textual variant. These are the signs that will accompany those who believe. In my name they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up serpents. And if they drink any deadly thing, it will not hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick and they will recover. Does it matter if Jesus said it? It certainly matters to the Christian groups in the Appalachian Mountains who practice snake handling as part of their worship services. Did Jesus give the entire Lord's Prayer or just half of it, as in Luke? Does it matter? It depends on which manuscript you read. Or do other textual variants matter? Does it matter whether the